Hi, everybody. Welcome to Inside Scoop with Sue. And today I have the great pleasure of talking to psychologist Madeline Levine, author of two New York Times bestsellers, The Price of Privilege and Teach Your Children Well. Her most recent book is Ready or Not, Preparing Our Kids to Thrive in an Uncertain and Rapidly Changing Book. Could not have done that in a more timely way. And Madeline is also a co-founder of Challenge Success, a project of Stanford Graduate School of Education that provides families and schools with practical research-based tools they need to create a more balanced and academically fulfilling life for kids. Thanks so much for being here with us.
My pleasure, Susan.
Okay, so I want to start with, you've been in this space of talking about this pandemic of anxiety and depression long before anyone else was really talking about it. And your most recent book, Ready or Not, which is about living with and coping with the uncertainty of life, came right as COVID was erupting. So I don't know, it seems to me like you have a crystal ball. What prompted you to write both of those books?
So I didn't have a crystal ball and I wasn't prescient. The world was...
I wanted to say that word, but I wasn't sure how to pronounce it. You know those words that you read?
Sure,
But
right. That's one of them,
Yeah.
$25 words. No,
Yeah.
I wasn't prescient. The world was changing before COVID and job requirements were changing. What mattered for the kinds of things that parents tend to be worried about, like grades and universities and jobs, had already radically changed long before COVID struck. The book came out 2 weeks before lockdown. So most of the tour was canceled, obviously. And it's interesting, we pushed the paperback out a year and a half as opposed to a year to be sure that this was all over. And it's not all over.
Yeah.
So this is the state of the world, and it's going to be the state of the world going forward of uncertainty. The pandemic is not over. There'll be another pandemic. There's a lot of change going on in the world. And to be frank, you're right. I have been in this space for 20 years and have spoken around the country, around the world, rising rates of anxiety, depression, stress, all that stuff. And this book really came out of my frustration with the fact that while individual communities and people and families and schools listened to the message, the country as a whole really didn't. And so every year I continued to see rising rates of mental illness, particularly anxiety and depression. And so I was like frustrated. It was either like, okay, I did my best, or I was going to look at different people this time, not my usual go-to, which tends to be psychologists and educators. I wanted to talk to people who live in the middle of change. And that was primarily corporate, CEOs, heads of hiring, the military, to see whether or not my idea that you needed a different skill set to be successful in a very uncertain world was actually true. And it was. And so it reinforced my idea that people needed to shift from an emphasis on performance to an emphasis on developing a skill set that would serve them both in life, lower rates of anxiety and depression, and be valuable for the jobs they were going to end up in eventually.
Well, tell us exactly. First of all, I think I love when people go outside of their space, because it is really the best way to see, like, corporate America understands how to work collaboratively and a host of other things that families don't have, right? That we could learn. So what exactly did you take away as, like, we're getting this wrong because that's what we need to know?
So I have a good little story about right before I started writing the book. So it's maybe 6 years ago. I went to get a mortgage, and my youngest son wanted to come with me. So he did. He was maybe 20 at the time. And I sat and I talked to the woman who was the head of the mortgage department. And it was maybe an hour. And my son, who's just very aware, would say, "Hey, Ma, it's like 25 minutes and it's only a half-hour meter. Let me go put in a quarter." He did that maybe twice. And once, you can hear I clear my throat because I speak so much. Once he said, I saw tea out there. Would you like a cup of tea? And then he asked the head of the mortgage. Anyway, at the end of that, she offers him a job. She knows nothing about him, nothing. She doesn't know if he goes to college, what he's interested in. So I was pretty amazed at that and said, that's nice, but explain it to me. And she said, I have everything I need to know. I can teach him. And I heard this over and over again from heads of hiring. I can teach him the logistics of what he needs to learn. I can't teach him to be the kind of person who says, can I help you? And she said, that's the person I want sitting next to me. That was my realization that in the real world, this stuff counted. Being collaborative, being flexible, being a little creative, being kind, empathic. These were the things that people were looking for, and they still are.
But we're living in a space and we're raising our kids in a space where the message is, it's not, I mean, people say parents are putting pressure on their kids, but there's a whole system out there that's doing it to our kids and saying your math grade matters so much that you should give up your volunteer job to put more time into your math.
So it's wrong. I mean, people expect me to come up with something brilliant. It's not. It's wrong. And I think the equally disturbing thing is, I think parents, for the most part, have actually gotten the message. Kids themselves now feel that their value depends on their grades. So they've internalized this. When I first started this, kids didn't. They were pissed off. They'd stomp around my office, get my parents off my back. It's too much homework. I don't like. Not anymore. Now kids are, hey, Dr. Levine, you're so naive. This is what you got to do. And so Challenge Success, for example, we work in teams around the country, but we don't work without having kids on the team, more kids than anything else, because they need to understand, and they do understand, that they're sacrificing an important part of their lives. And this isn't just like, woo-woo stuff. It's when you think about what kids have to accomplish. My 3 kids are millennials. They're grown up. And when I think about what had to be accomplished to get them where they are, which is, married, one has 2 children as of today.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you. They had to learn how to not just do math, they had to learn how to talk to the girl next to them. I have 3 sons. They had to learn how to help out in the house. They had to learn what they were interested in. They had to learn to accept their body. My actor son is almost 6'5", and my athlete son is 5'10" and calls his older brother a waste of height. They had to adapt to themselves, their bodies, their interests, their talents, their capacities, their ability to navigate on their own, to be independent. And we forget that. We forget that takes time and bandwidth. And if all you're doing is going to school, studying, and doing extracurriculars, you don't have the time for that work. And that's why we see this late to launch phenomenon now, which we never used to see.
Well, and so let's go back to really what you talk about is this pandemic of anxiety. And so going down this narrow path of how we define success, is that what's underlying this rise in anxiety?
Well, I think you said it right, that it's not just your family or individual families. There's a huge cultural value on money, on materialism. How do you get to have more money? I'm not sure what it is today, but recently something like 60% of the Harvard graduates went into finance. I find it hard to believe that the majority of people at Harvard, that's their greatest interest in money. Maybe I'm wrong, but we need to broaden the idea of what makes for a good life, what makes for a successful life. I work with very, very wealthy people. And, the research is once you've got 70,000 or something like that, there's no real difference in your happiness. And that all this work that went into going to Yale instead of NYU barely pays off a little bit. But the question is, emotionally, was it worth the time and effort taken away from all these other things, building a coping skill toolbox, to spend all your time upping your grades? I don't think so. And we know not from the fact that most kids say that their academic stress is one of the biggest reasons for their anxiety and depression.
All right. So our job as parents, I mean, we so definitely we overparent our kids. That's one of the things that you started talking about early.
Mm-hmm.
And now if we talk to parents of teenagers, so middle school and high school kids, how
Mm-hmm.
do we change the culture we raise them in? And sometimes we did it unwittingly. Like it wasn't, we saw what the prize was and we wanted the prize, but we didn't recognize what the cost was. So how do we reverse that now?
I think there are a few things parents need to do. You know, I've seen parents, they wait at the door. Kids are very good at mocking their parents. And the kid comes home from school.
I think that's my kids' superpowers. They're all so good at that.
Yeah, right. It's a talent, you know. Yeah. And the mom says, "Oh, how'd you do? What'd you get on that math grade today?" Home should be kind of a sanctuary. And your kid comes home, please don't ask about their scores or their grades or their popularity or any of that. You know, serve a couple cookies if you're there, sit down, how'd it go, period. And so one thing we do is shift what we pay attention to. Excuse me. The other thing is to be aware of all the unconscious ways that this message comes through. So I've been at people's dinner tables, you know, when I'm trying to figure out what's going on, I get to sit and see what really goes on. And a family that says, we never talk about grades. We don't. And I sit with them at dinner for a few nights and they don't. However, they talk about the Jaguar down the block. They talk about who got into Goldman Sachs. You know, it's all about achievement. And look at what's going on in this country right now. If we don't start placing some value on what'd you do to help somebody today? Is there a new kid in school? It must be hard for new kids who haven't been in school for a year and it's COVID. And what did you do to help them? What can you do to help them? I mean, that's the shift in attention that I think we need to bring.
It requires, I say this as a mother who erred with some of her kids and then had enough of them that I could correct.
Good
but
you.
Its theory is very easy, but its practice is very challenging.
Right. So who told any of us that parenting was going to be easy? I mean, there's a million books, the hardest job you'll ever have. Parenting is hard, and overcoming our own biases, which, you know, I want to be clear, always come out of concern that our kids do well. None of this, well, some of it comes out of some narcissism, but mostly it comes out of our worry about how are our kids going to do. It's more competitive, it's global. You want to make sure your kids are doing well. And when you catch yourself, I think those are great opportunities to take a minute. I don't want to make this sound like you're going around all day long, you know, paying attention to everything you do. But I had a moment in my own house. My oldest son once said to me, Ma, what could I be besides a lawyer, a doctor, or an accountant? And it's like, we never said a word to this child about what he should be. And he's Jewish. We're Jewish. It's like, I don't know. He got that idea that that was the only thing he could be. And I was hurt. You know, I was like, whoa, we never said that. Where did you get that from? And he said, you don't have to say anything. Look around the house. Look around the neighborhood. Look around the cars that are driven. And I learned a lot from that. So it's not only what we say intentionally or unintentionally, it's the messages that kids pick up from our community. And we have to talk to them about that.
Yeah. Okay, so if you're listening to this and this is like resonating with you, that's The Price of Privilege. Get that book. I want to pivot a little bit in terms of this overparenting. You say that, I think you said ruthless accommodation,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
no, not ruthless accommodation.
Relentless accommodation, something like that.
That's the idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that is all the pictures of like people bubble wrapping their kids. And does that impact? I mean, again, we do that out of a good place, but does that impact kids' anxiety also? Is there any connection between those two things?
Absolutely. You know, we didn't used to have failure to launch programs. Now I probably send a kid a month to one of these programs. They don't have a skill set. Parents are trying to do too much. So a very concrete example, because it happened this morning, I get a call from a mom. Her son is going down to LA. He's late getting an apartment. He's a graduate student, so he's 25. Should she go with him? And I'm like, no, you shouldn't go with him. Well, why not? There are no apartments left. It's going to be hard. Anyway, she let him, this was yesterday, she let him go. He found an apartment. So she called me this morning, and it's kind of like, see, it was hard for him. That's a good thing. It was not impossible for him, and it's to be expected for a 25-year-old that they can get their own. And if you had gone, you would have taken away the opportunity to build a sense of agency. Yes, it's hard, but I can do it. And every time we step in unnecessarily, we rob children of their opportunity to, one, become resilient, right? Who is it? Batman and his butler. One of them says to the other, why do we fall down? And Batman answers, so we can get up again. And I like that. I think that's true. So some of the times our kids will fall, but that is the process by which we develop resilience. And if we're going to need anything going forward, it's going to be for us to be resilient, because self-care is childcare, and for our kids to be resilient.
I love robbing the concept of robbing our kids of something they need is so painful for me to hear as a mother, that I think I could overcome the urge of the other thing more because of that, just that one phrase, that I took away an opportunity from my kid by thinking I was helping them. I think that's great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we're living through right now. So first of all, your paperback has an added component to it. Can you talk about what you added?
So it seemed ridiculous to put out a book about change without acknowledging the kind of change we've gone through in the last year. I think that the introduction was really about making clear that this is not temporary, and that the skill set of resilience, which people really don't understand. People, there is no resilience gene. There is no, the families that did well during COVID were not particularly heroic or different. They were resilient. And if you're all focused on performance, you don't get to spend enough time on resilience. And resilience is some combination of creativity and flexibility and empathy and perseverance, right? Those are the things that helped people to get through. And I wanted to make the point that those things are eminently teachable, right? They are just as teachable as algebra, but we don't spend a lot of time teaching it. And since I believe, and so does everybody else in corporate America and the military, that we will continue to be under some combination of uncertain circumstances, that's where the emphasis needs to be. So that was the point of the introduction. And getting through this, Susan, was incredibly hard. In the very beginning, when I was still speaking, moving around the first couple of weeks, and I said to people, your job is to get through this, period. Get through it. And I remember one woman raises her hand and says, Dr. Levine, that's such a low bar. Shouldn't we be, blah, blah, doing all this stuff? And, nobody says that to me anymore. Now it's like, if you can get through this,
right,
you've really accomplished a lot, because we have no history, no data, no practice on what it's like to get through a time like this. So you got to figure out when I say, self-care is childcare. I was talking to somebody yesterday and we were comparing ice creams because that's where we both apparently went just for 15 minutes of feeling better. And you got to figure out what it is that's nourishing. I mean, it's not great to say ice cream on air, but oh well, that's the reality. And the reality is that a lot of people are vegging out. I just finished watching 7 seasons of Bosch in about a week. Whatever it is that gets you through, as long as it's not, drugs and alcohol or anything like that. I think getting through was actually a high bar.
I would agree. And I think we all know that now. You again were just crystal balling, because I still can't pronounce the word.
Prescient.
You were, because you knew beforehand that the bar was being set very high to say that we needed to get through this. But some people aren't, and painfully, some of our kids aren't.
Right.
So what do we do in situations where, the picture of the family around the table doing a puzzle, playing a game, isn't true in every house, and that the kid who has locked themselves into their room, not with a door lock, but with an emotional lock,
mm-hmm.
What does a parent do there?
So I want to acknowledge that there is a whole group of people in this country who have done poorly, who started out in poverty or, financially challenged, who lost jobs, who have 3 children and no income and are worried about housing. And that's kind of different than what I'm talking about, although the bar is still to get through. Those kids are much more vulnerable. And it gives me an opportunity to make a pitch, which is the kids that I was treating in the last year and a half. Every one of them ended up with a lot of encouragement from me, doing something that was of purpose and aware of the inequity. So when kids would come and say, I'm bored and I'm depressed and I'm this and that, it was like, okay, here's a list of things you could do. You could teach these kids that we're talking about so that they don't lose an entire year of academics. You can bring groceries and just ring the bell. You can make a phone call. And every kid I saw ended up doing something and feeling better. So that's just my pitch for throwing in, for kids who are more privileged, throwing in the importance of a sense of purpose in this time, because teenagers often feel like, they don't count. And they really did count during this. They really were important in mobilizing resources in communities. So I just lost the track of what you asked me.
So the kid is locked in the room.
In the room, yeah.
And the mother is hearing all of these experts coming on with all this sound advice, but it takes 2 to make that relationship change.
Right. And I want to be clear about something. Most kids will make it through okay. I was just on with Child Mind Institute in New York, and they were doing their research, which is always a good place to be aware of for anybody who needs help out there. Child Mind Institute in New York. 60% of kids have no diagnosis and are fine. 25% have a diagnosis. That's an unbelievably high number. 15% are what we call subclinical, sort of starting, but not too bad yet. So that means that who's going to come through this? For the most part, the kids who were fine to start with are going to be fine at the end of this. I don't like using the word trauma for this because I've worked with, people having their best friend's head blown off, and that is a different kind of trauma. But it's been incredibly challenging. Most kids will make it through okay. How do we know when a kid is really in trouble? The locked in the room, I won't talk to you. So we use the same thing a clinician would use. We use duration and intensity. If your kid's locked in his room, and that's kind of what he does when he's unhappy, and it's 3 days, don't worry about it yet. If your kid is not somebody who locks himself in his room and he's there 2 weeks later, not getting out of bed, and won't talk to you, that is an issue. Call the pediatrician, call a therapist, call somebody who knows more about kids. So you're looking for duration and severity. And some kids who are fine are having problems. The kids who are having the most problems, Susan, are kids who were anxious to begin with. You can imagine if you had OCD before, and now, oh yeah, touch things, right? If you those are the kids who you really need to keep an eye on. If your kid was fine before, the odds are great in his or her favor that they'll make it through this. And just to add, media doesn't like that story. We don't get a lot of stories about most kids will be fine. We get a lot of stories about the kids who are having serious difficulties. They deserve airtime, but the reality that most kids will compensate for this doesn't get much, and it's a fact. So.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question. Before then, I want to just say we have some books to give away. So email me at editor@yourteenmag.com. I think Jessica put it in the comments, and we'll put you into a raffle for some copies of the book. And I want to end on this question of some of the kids that were anxious before actually did great during COVID.
Right.
Because some of the stressors in their lives were actually in school. Right. So what I want to ask you is, how important is it for kids to be pushed back into a brick and mortar school if they thrived doing online learning?
So, all educators are struggling with that. You're absolutely right. It's an important point. The kid who was socially phobic, the kid who got teased for being gay or fat or whatever, did better. And I think that there is a process of reevaluating how kids are being taught. For me, if it was my kid who thrived online, I'd want to keep them online, making sure that there were enough opportunities for socialization and that kind of thing. But, having a hard time in school is miserable, right? For kids with learning disabilities, kids with social phobia. We have to rethink how we can educate those kids digitally and not leave out the social aspects that a kid gets and needs to learn. That kid needs to learn how to function with other kids. But coming out of something like this, if it was my kid, I would not add to the stressor.
All right, Madeline Levine, I'd like to talk to you for a few more hours, but apparently you have someone else to talk to right now. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Susan.